Welcome to Divcasts from the University of Chicago Divinity School. For more of our podcasts and information about our terms of use, please see our website, divinity.uchicago.edu/podcasts.
So I'd like to introduce our fourth and last speaker, but I actually have asked Michael Petticourt to do that. Michael is an MA student in Middle Eastern Studies in the Social Sciences Division.
Hello, everyone. It is my distinct pleasure today to introduce Professor Tomoko Masuzawa. Dr. Masuzawa earned her PhD in Religious Studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and is currently a professor of Comparative Literature and History at the University of Michigan. Dr. Masuzawa's primary research area is the history of the modern European discourses of religion, with a special emphasis on academic and secular discourses. Her principal publications include In Search of Dreamtime, The Quest for the Origin of Religion, published 1993, and The Invention of World Religions, or How European Universalism Was Preserved in the Language of Pluralism, 2005, which received that year's Association of American Publishers Award for Excellence in Professional and Academic Publishing in the category of Theology and Religious Studies. Her current book projects comprise two monographs entitled Making of the Academic Secular University Movement in the 19th Century and The Promise of the Secular, William Robertson Smith and the Constitution of Biblical Studies. I was first introduced to Professor Masuzawa's work this quarter in Professor Monica Ringer's seminar on secularism and the citizen in the Middle East. Dr. Masuzawa's The Invention of World Religions served as the theoretical introduction to our class's discourse on religion. In this work, Dr. Masuzawa challenges the textual portrayal of the world religions as a universal phenomenon, pointing to the term's implicit assumption that religion acts as one of the most important features for categorizing a society. She then provides a sophisticated analysis of 19th century European scholars' categorization of religions, according to philological demarcations of race and ethnicity. This efflorescence of categorization in the 19th century became the medium through which these scholars posited European superiority on an elaborate religious spectrum and led to constructed concepts like European rationalism and Protestant exceptionalism. Dr. Masuzawa's writings on these last two theories fueled debate within our seminar on the aspirations of 19th century European scholarship. In particular, our conversation focused on the ways in which categorization during this period facilitated the desire of these scholars to establish European evolutionary hegemony as well as their pursuit of higher truth through a blend of rationalism and Christian doctrinal refinement. Professor Masuzawa will continue this discussion on categorization within religious studies with her presentation today entitled Trifurcating Abraham, the Rise of Philology and the Disaggregation of Jewish, Islamic, and Biblical Studies. Please join me in welcoming Professor Masuzawa.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the, organizers, facilitators, in particular, of course, Monica Ringer, for this invitation and this opportunity. Although the academic conferences are a legion, occasions of this particular sort are actually not that common, where I get to learn about some of the emerging works of scholarship, especially in the field of expertise outside my own. And it is also also an uncommon opportunity in that I am permitted, in fact asked, to talk about a work still under construction, so to speak, without a demand to mold the presentation of the project to serve any rigidly specified purpose. In other words, and this is a warning, I'm taking full advantage of the organizer's directive, and I am going to make a rather broad claim and in the form of a promissory note for a delivery sometime in the future. However, I'll try not to abuse the occasion, even if I am to present here a project still in a, so to say, a soft shell stage, a creature still floating in a large pool of generality. My strategy here today, accordingly, is first to take a few tentative dip into this rather indeterminate body of water, and then zoom into an area of more specific concern. And finally, I hope to arrive at the very title of my talk, which I sent in so many months ago, ever optimistic as I was in the estimation of what I could accomplish in the period of time that lies ahead of me instead of behind, that's where it is. Let me begin then with a few dipping into the water. Those of you familiar with the lay of the land in religious studies in North America are no doubt well aware of the curiously twinned structure of the field, represented by two learned societies, that is, American Academy of Religion and Society for Biblical Literature. These two societies couple and decouple on various occasions, engage and disengage regularly, and not infrequently quarrel. Well, what can I say about them? To begin, these two bodies are not immediately symmetrical, either in size or in scope. And as with any deeply entrenched division of long-standing, they do not agree on the nature of the difference that divides them. One could say, relatively uncontroversially, I suppose, that the AAR claims or aspires to be global and pluralistic in orientation, whereas SBL is essentially monocentric and centripetal for the reason that it is permanently riveted to a particular legacy, namely the biblical. Once this symmetry is acknowledged, however, the binary structure itself seems to be well established. All this may be but a matter of local curiosity, a fact sufficiently obscure and trivial for most outsiders to feel perfectly at liberty to ignore or to remain confused about. And if I draw attention to this matter now, it is certainly not for any intrinsic interest of the situation, but rather because of what I believe this binary belies. For there is a further complicating factor lurking in the middle, a tertiary domain that muddled the bifurcation, and as such something that routinely is subjected to repression. Now, to give a name to this confounding domain, one could call it Islam, or more historically appropriate for the purpose at hand, Arabic, and also, by extension, which I'm yet to explain, Semitic philology. To shed a somewhat different light on this complicating factor from another angle, and to do so in an admittedly simplified manner, let me relate an anecdote. I realize this is, of course, inexcusably personal tactic, but it might ring a bell to at least to some of you who are at least closer to my age. There may not be too many. Just about 30 years ago, when I first landed a teaching position in a proverbial picture-perfect small liberal arts college in New England, my assignments included a survey course entitled Western Religions. Having studied mostly 19th and 20th century European intellectual history up to that point, I took a deep breath and resolved to take the situation in stride. But before I had a chance to exhale, it came to my attention that, much to my consternation, a colleague in this small department, a specialist in Buddhism, had recently rearranged things a bit, and in short, he ejected Islam out of his survey course on Eastern religions, claiming that it didn't really belong there. Well, fair enough. But what was I to do? It was now up to me to give myself a crash course on how to cover Islam in 3 weeks, and even more of a challenge, to explain to my befuddled students why a wide swath of civilization that stretched from Morocco to Indonesia belonged to the West. This was obviously more than a teaching moment for all concerned. By the way, this colleague in question has been my husband of the last 25 years. So you can say that we somehow got over that one. The occasion drove home to me, perhaps for the first time, but with clarity that would render experiences of this sort irreversible, that the West nay, Europe itself, insofar as the West is presumed to be the emanation of Europe, is an object illusion of the first order, of the most interesting and most invincible kind. From that moment on, I have understood the West to be first and foremost a placeholder for a subject position, might say the subject position, as well as a sustained claim for a certain ordering of the world. It was only sometimes thereafter, and only gradually, that this line of thinking led to further developments in the form of a string of suspicions, which I am now attempting to elevate to the status of hypotheses. And these are these. One, that a domain vaguely named as Islam, which is, of course, is a shorthand, has been a constitutive and indispensable factor in enabling the self-appellation of Europe, somebody that has already mentioned. That is Islam, or in the earlier designations, Saracens, Mohammedans, Turks, Orientals, and so on, has played its delimiting, if you will, or describing role vis-a-vis Europe or Christendom in different ways, in different moments in history. And that's the first point. The second suspicion, or would be hypothesis, that the discourse on religion, that is, the discourse that plays out the dynamics of the then newly discovered, as of early modern period, this newly discovered object, recognized object, religion, against a variety of its others, including the presumptive moment of religion's passing or its overcoming, namely the secular. This discourse of religion, in this complex sense, has also played an integral, indeed absolutely essential role in sustaining and rationalizing, in the Weberian sense of that term, Europe. Europe that is an immanent global projection, or what amounts to the same thing in Freud's language, its intra-psychic perception, he would say that. Suffice it to say that on that moment 30 years ago, I was duly set on course on a career in historicizing the West. Now, in the event that this narrative itself is getting a once too personal and dangerously grand at the same time, let me stop here, and just with this remark. My baseline cognition, or perhaps better, my analytic strategy based on this cognition, could be summarized as follows. Europe may be less a place than an argument, an enduring, compelling, and on the whole, wildly successful argument, and it should be taken seriously as such. Now, by calling it an argument, I trust you understand that I am not making Europe any less real than it seems when we think of it as a place. Nor am I inclined to consider the tenuousness of the constitution of Europe along the synchronic or spatial axis as if it were a matter of border disputes. Rather, I think it is along the chronological and historical axis that we begin to see more clearly both the formation and the logic of the argument that is Europe. And it should come as no surprise, probably, if I were to add here, that another suggestion that this argument begins in earnest, that is, argument of Europe, begins in earnest and begins to gather force sometime around the 16th century, that is, just about the time when we begin to see the use of the word religion in the plural and in the sense more or less recognizable by us. My own interest has been to track the development or vicissitude of this religion discourse. Most broadly speaking, from the early 16th century to today, but with a particular attention to the complicated transformation occurring in the latter half of the 19th century. To return momentarily to the two instances of a wobbly binary continually being unsettled by an unspoken tertiary element, that is, two cases, on one hand, the AR versus SBL, and on the other, Western religion versus Eastern religions, I do not mean to imply that those two binaries are isomorphic or equivalent. For even if you were to allow that something like Islam, Arabic, or Semitic could be at least symbolically affixed to the problematic tertiary space, binaries themselves are differently configured, each with different histories. But the point here is not identity or homology, but difference. A difference slight enough to invite comparison, sometimes conflation, and even transposition. And yet, with a differential gap wide enough to induce or enable certain slippage, a shift, and eventual transmutation. My sense is that religion discourse since the early modern period, together with the cognate, what I will call cognate discourses on language varieties and on race, has developed or transmogrified precisely by such slipping and sliding. More specifically, my attention is currently fixed on the sudden change occurring towards the end of the 19th century when the older scholarly regime of biblical philology or biblical theology, those two things are very difficult to distinguish up until that point, how this regime collapsed. That is, when the venerable tradition of piety and scholarship, in which the study of Hebrew and Greek was invariably accompanied by Arabic and Latin sources, this regime precipitously declined, and the scholarly labor pertaining to so-called three Abrahamic religions went on separate ways. But before Abraham, of course, as we recall, the tripartite disaggregation of humankind was presaged in an earlier point in the biblical narrative. And let me see here. There we go. Here we have three sons of Noah holding the world, all three continents, then none. Right. So you can see that this is from Nuremberg Chronicle, published in 1493 in Germany, of course. And so you can see this is already an early modern depiction of it. You see the Japheth on the west, and the east is Shem, and then indefinable, the rest, I suppose, is the territory of Ham. Right? So Earth, you can sort of vaguely recognize the continent as it is, and if you want to see it a little bit more accurate one, this is what they're holding, you can see, right, more or less, yes? The known world, three brothers, east, west, and the rest. So that's how it works. Now, the subsequent fates of these three sons and their descendants, and the reasons for these differences and inequality, have been attributed to an incident in one fateful day in the vineyard, right? So I'm sure most of you are familiar with this, that one day the middle son, Ham, come upon their father actually drunk and naked, sleeping in the vineyard. And he reports to two other brothers, and two other brothers, in order to avoid seeing that very naked body of the father, they come to walking backwards with cloth, and then to come to cover the naked body of the father. But in this rendition, again, I emphasize that this is the 1493. Japheth is actually not party to even trying to cover, but he's the one who is deliberately avoiding the scene, right? Whereas Ham is actually tugging on his robe as if to try to induce him unsuccessfully to try to put the gaze. So I think it is a very interesting twist, because this is not really the biblical narrative version. But you can sort of see clearly the future fate of Ham and Japheth, Europe and the rest, in this image. Whereas this one is more, you might say, literal translation of the biblical narrative itself. And two brothers the Ham is the one who is pointing, right, to the nakedness, and then two brothers are actually walking backwards with cloth, which is the cover. So this is really actually more accurate as far as like the narrative itself is concerned. But I think it is a very interesting one that this early modern one is actually transposing this. And also, this is my end point of my narrative, very late 19th century. Here is the one that's also literal, but very interestingly, it seems like it's Orientalized and at the same time racialized. You see? I mean, you don't have to even ask, well, which one is Japheth? Well, he's blonde, despite this weird clothing, right? And Ham is obviously the one on the right, the wild man. So I thought this was a very interesting depiction. So anyway, my narrative really runs from that Nuremberg version, the very late 15th century to the very late 19th century. So here we are, and back to the Nuremberg. To go back to the earlier point, Nuremberg Chronicle provides a view from the cusp of the pre-modern to modern world. Perhaps the last glow of an ancient mapping about to slip, slide, and morph into something different and new. Forward 200, sorry, there's a water bottle. This is just to say that, to signal to me that there is a transition moment here. Fast forward a little over 200 years, we see another configuration of the world and its peoples. This frontispiece adorning the first volume of the so-called ceremonies and religious customs of the known world, and this is the title page of the book from which, was clearly meant as a panoramic view of all religions in the world, as the title suggests, executed by a certain a celebrated engraver by the name of Bernard Picard, Frenchman. This costly yet extremely popular work was first published in Amsterdam by the printing house of Jean-Frédéric Bernard, who almost certainly wrote the text. It is a work of extraordinary interest, but today I will refer to this frontispiece only, and only one element of this highly complex image. So here it is. And I sectioned it out here so that you can see. Immediately we discern two horizontal lines, each with a jog or two, dividing the composition into three: foreground, center, and the background. Uppermost are the distant pagans, where the rest, right? The pagans. Whereas in the foreground, a peaceful assembly of Mohammedans, as they used to be called more commonly. Center is occupied by a raucous congregation of Christians teeming with figures representing various sects whose numbers must be countless, judging from the bobbing heads that disappear into the obscurity. So this is the middle section, you can see. Within a domain of Christians, we see a division in the middle, parting the Catholic realm from the Protestant. On the right, the dominant figure is a Catholic church, adorned with the papal crown and with a large open book beside her. But this is not a Bible, but rather, if you read it, a registry of concilia and traditiones, namely councils and successions of popes. Underfoot are two earlier dispensations, the biblical antiquity and Greco-Roman antiquity. Now both fall into the ground, but still in the full glory of their classical splendor. Both of these vanquished look up towards the victorious church almost adoringly. The Israelite reveals the sacred Hebrew script, whereas the Roman offers an orb topped with a winged victory. So this is like a fantasy of European tap roots of Europe as biblical and classical at the same time. To the left of all this are the Protestants. Luther, Calvin, John Knox, and many other figures are recognizable. But the focal point of this domain is no doubt the young woman in white, holding an open Bible inscribed in several different languages. The figure to her immediate right is evidently an emissary from the Catholic domain. He's pushing to close her vernacular Bible while pointing with his other hand towards the Catholic Church and to the Book of Councils and Successions, thus making the irreconcilable choices all the more apparent. Yet, as we back away from this drama a bit and assume the proper position of the viewer of the image as image, that is to say, if we are just to look at this as a flat surface, our attention is immediately drawn to the quiet figure occupying the dead center. See, positioned immediately next to and configured as something of a counterpart to that aforementioned either-or figure, presenting the choice between the open Bible and the authority of the church. This darker figure seems to have it both ways. For while his placid white mask looks up to the Catholic Church with its empty eyes directed straight at her Book of Councils and Successions, his dark furrowed face beneath the mask peers down intently as a different kind of book, which is in Hebrew. No one else, including the Israelite who holds the scroll, seems to be looking at this ancient script. So you see this figure a little more in a close-up. This dark figure appears to be somehow abstracted from the surroundings, as if the billowing folds of his robe were in fact opening to another world. Exotically attired, he's making a surreptitious study of an ancient Oriental script. As many philologists since the early modern times knew, this sort of study, even when undertaken with pious intentions, has been a risky enterprise, invariably coming under surveillance by authorities sooner or later. And I think in the 19th century, I'll show you my true hero. This is a caricature of William Robertson Smith, who is the subject of my book, actually, who was put on trial for publishing this article in the Encyclopedia Britannica 9th edition called The Bible. So you can see in his hand, what he's holding there is Encyclopedia Britannica. So when I saw that figure in the middle in the Picard's engravings, I couldn't help thinking about him. So in Picard's image, we'll go back to that, this philological enterprise is being carried out right in the bullseyes of the picture by escaping the notice of everyone around him. And if we step back and view the pictorial plane of this image as just what it is, that is, as a two-dimensional surface, the line of this cleric scholar's gaze, immediately directed to the Hebrew scroll, drops down further to yet another open book below, the one that is the preaching imam's hand. And so does the line extending from his remarkably shaped staff, as if to reinforce the target of his gaze. See what I mean? This is not obviously what is meant, but we see it, right? Because we see the picture and then we see the line. Although we cannot see the writing on the pages of the Muslim's book, it is presumably in Arabic, and it is apt. For from the days of Guillaume Postel to the path-breaking generation of the 19th century biblical scholars, classical literature in Arabic had been an indispensable ancillary body of knowledge for any serious student of Old Testament. This long scholarly tradition came to an abrupt end in the late 19th century, though not for wrong reasons only, I must admit. In the latter half of the 19th century, in other words, pioneering archaeologists traversing the Near East began to uncover and then soon thereafter deciphered many other ancient tongues that were either contemporaneous with or in fact immensely older than Biblical Hebrew. As a result of these discoveries and advancements in knowledge of the ancient Near East, the relative significance of Arabic sources was diminished, and thenceforward biblical studies and Islamic studies went their separate ways. But until that moment, almost all the prominent biblical scholars, anything from Mohammed Ewald, Abraham Kühnen, Julius Wellhausen, and of course William Robertson Smith, all of them dedicated much of their labor to Arabic studies, and some of them managed to sustain their precarious clerical academic living by obtaining professorships in Arabic in the Faculty of Arts and Science after they were forced to evacuate their chairs in the divinity faculty. That was true, more or less. I mean, certainly that was true in the case of Will Robertson Smith, but also Wellhausen as well. Here, then, thanks to the enigmatic figure halfway removed from the world in which he is represented, yet confronting us directly in his full two-dimensionality, we are able to see another triangulation of sorts, though the configuration is at once truncated and excessive, complicated by other books and other objects surrounding it. All the same, we have a glimpse of a certain historical truth expressed in this picture in the pictorial unconscious, as it were, as if in a dream. How did the biblical philology or theology get here, starting presumably from the Nuremberg mapping? With what consequence, and what were the ramifications of sudden collapse of this triangulation? And finally, is there a sign of its resurgence in recent years? For example, in the recent development at both Oxford and Cambridge universities, where a new professorial chair in Abrahamic religion has been instituted. I should like to leave you with a little coda, which happened to be less about the Bible or about religion, but more about mapping. What might be, what might it mean to begin to disaggregate the European argument, which seems to be so stubbornly entrenched in our collective imaginary as a particular map? And here's the image. You see this immediately? Here's a map of the world created by a novel method of projection. It's called Dymaxion map. To begin, the spherical Earth is projected onto a icosahedron, which is a polygon comprising, here it is. Icosahedron, which is a polygon comprising 20 equal triangles. And here is a way to unfold it. And using the more recent satellite photo of the Earth, it looks like this. As you may have guessed it already, this is a technique invented by Buckminster Fuller in 1940s. His intention, apparently, was that the polygon should be unfolded in any number of ways. For instance, this version, of course, is a geocentric one, preserving the integrity of the land masses above all. Or it could be unfolded oceanocentric, if you will. But then, of course, that may have its own purpose, but I'll go back to, for the time being, the one that is perhaps more familiar. So you see, these are all different unfoldings. Even though this, I might say, is more familiar, and yet, usually when I show it to my students, it takes a few moments before anybody recognizes what it is. Right? And also, I think it really does show a couple of things that you may not notice so much. I was always puzzled that this argument that Europe isn't an argument that Europe isn't really a continent, but it's a peninsula of Eurasia. And yet, I did not quite always understand that Africa could be also part of it. But now, seen this way, it looks like that too, right? That Africa is very much part of it. And in fact, this is a much better way of understanding human migration, which is, all of us out of Africa, right? And it's a very interesting thing because it's in different periods. Migration has occurred because of the shrinking and expanding ice coverage of the earth. That's why, but it does make, this is mitochondrial DNA differential, a map of migration that's speculated on the basis of that. So, as you have guessed, this human migration is a one thing that I think you can see it quite well in this map rather than the more conventional one. So what I'm suggesting here may be summed up thus. Whatever religion may be, or whatever the phenomena we have been accustomed to call religion may be, the discourse on religion, which dates back roughly to the time of Nuremberg Chronicle, has always been about mapping people. For some time, we have been living and operating in accordance with the map that is Europe, and an argument that is Europe. Today, unless we muster enough courage, nerve, wits, or whatever it takes to begin unfolding the projection of the world in different ways, we may run the risk of living and withering in the same old world order, forever creasing the same fault lines over and over until it finally falls apart. Thank you. There might be, yeah, it's okay. Yeah, right.
Questions?
I have an observation. You started with your talking about the AAR and the SPL, and they meet and they don't meet together, and they do meet together, and they've gone through divorces and even have their fraternity times. And they're different constituencies and so on and sizes. There's a new organization now called the International Quranic Studies Association, which is now meeting for a few years in affiliation with AAR and eventually will go off on its own orbit. So the third leg or whatever may come with it.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting because I think that organization itself is, the different, SBL is quite old. Goes back to this kind of a height of when philology is really becoming science, middle of the 19th century, whereas AAR has a much later date. So by the time AAR comes into the scene, it's already, the kind of rejection of the Arabic has already taken place from the SBL. Not that the SBL people became hostile or anything like that, but simply now I think people, if you had asked, well, if you're in Islamic studies between those two organizations, where would you go? And of course, they would look for Islamic studies, it would be AAR rather than SBL. But I guess one of the things that I wanted to point out that this is a particular historical moment that made it so. But thank you for the observation. That's very interesting.
It's very interesting that when you call scientific philology emerged, but it was, philology was of course wonderful for looking at various kinds of textry, classical texts, and discovering the relationships between different manuscripts and working all that out to get an accurate, earliest version of the text, and for the local text it was the same thing. But it was also deeply a part of the nationalist impetus.
Oh, absolutely.
It rationale, in a sense, for national identities.
No, I think it is right. And in fact, the Picard's date, that early 18th century, still the Romans soldiers stood for the classical antiquity, whereas by the end, of course, it will have to be Greek, right? It has to be Greek by then. So all these kind of transformations and what stands for, it's very interesting. Yes?
Tell us about the DNA.
Pardon me?
Tell us about the DNA. Tell me anyway about the DNA.
Oh, well, I know only, I teach a course on, this undergraduate course on the concept of race. So starting from late 18th century to today, essentially, what happened in the 19th century, which is just massively repressed now. So, but anyway, it's an interesting one on this one. It's essentially, you can see that there's numbers up there. It's, the dating is the one in blue at the bottom is, of course, it's the youngest. It's 9 millennia to 7 millennia before present. It's BP. When the present is 1950. I always like to say that I really was born on the early age of the present.
Well, I was just growing up, that's the first.
Yes. But 1950 was, of course, a year or so after the discovery, or rather, of the carbon dating. So suddenly the dating of the past became scientific again. And so that's why now we are sort of separate 1950 as the present. And so that means the dark red is the oldest. Yeah. So, yes,
yeah, I have a question about the relation between Hebrew and Arabic. As I understand it, I have a very fragmentary knowledge of it, but in the Netherlands it was in the 16th century that Sephardic Jews settled in Amsterdam, and then of course Spinoza became the most famous. But there was a lot of interaction between people who studied the Bible in the theology school. And people who could read Hebrew quite well were just immigrating. Did Arabic play any role there?
Yes, well, that's an interesting question. That's a whole other story. And I also tell it to introduce this project, or rather the subject, to in undergraduate classes. I start out with what is supposed to be the classical Europe really was. And so in a way, Europe, this is, I guess, at the strongest formulation, my argument is, Europe really, as we think of it, doesn't come into formation until this early modern time. Because until then, it's basically a Mediterranean world. And half of the Mediterranean world, of course, spoke Arabic. So to sort of begin to see, well, where is the Arabic really come into Europe? You need to reformulate that question a bit. Because what Europe now claims as its own past is another world in which Arabic was present. It wasn't a foreign body, right? So actually I have, these are, by the way, salaries. I kind of done it out in Oxford. When the first Arabic chair was instituted, and so all these things did not become, let's see, where can I? Yeah, I show this, right, the Roman world at its maximum. And, Germania, which of course becomes a sort of body of future Europe, it's the part that is outside. Europe, the Romans couldn't control. That's what it was. And of course, they are the ones who come, right? And make a big, and then finally the Roman Empire falls because of that. And then as of the 12th century, this is what Mediterranean world looks like, right? It is essentially Arabic-speaking world. So it's on the basis of this, through the High Middle Ages to early modern period, that gradually Europe begins to constitute itself. And so that's why, from that point, in a way, from this world, Arabic becomes a foreign language. It wasn't, right? I mean, we know that, for example, Frederick the Great of the King of Naples spoke Arabic, right? The famous kind of heretic who the Pope excommunicated because he went on supposedly crusade, but instead of fighting with the enemies, he negotiated with them. And so on the basis of that, Pope, whichever Pope it was, excommunicated him. And so he was famous for being an Arabic speaker. He could speak German, of course he could speak Italian, but Arabic was part of his. So where would we think? You know, so so I don't think it really waited until the beginning of the scholarship for Europe to learn or to begin to absorb into its world the Arabic culture. So, I mean, I know it's a kind of a deflecting kind of an answer to your question.
Were there chairs in Arabic at, say, Leiden University in the 16th century?
Yes, in fact, it was Henry VIII who established, I think it was, it's one of the Regis professorships, together with, you know, Hebrew and so on, and I think it wasn't a Regis professor. It was following that, but shortly after, not long after. So 16th, 17th century is there. But it was understood to be part of the, you know, study of the sacred scriptures somehow. Its history is very long.
It's longer than history.
Modern history, certainly.
The first year of history is like 1810 or 1812 in Berlin, I think.
Yes, yes.
Arab chairs versus
Right,
the
right.
17th century.
Sorry, these are all sort of figures. You can see some of the things. Lord Almoner in Arabic, this was Smith's position. Yeah, 40 pounds. Because it was instituted in those, you know, because these were not the endowments, but rather it's a stipulation that the king will pay this much, and this didn't change from the time of the Tudor period.
Well, the figures are really interesting. I mean,
Oh,
the professor of
absolutely.
Sanskrit is 500.
Well, this is a new one. The Sanskrit chair was instituted in the 19th century. What it is I don't know what happened to this one, but here you can see the Regis Professor of Divinity, Regis Professor of Hebrew, Margaret Professor of Divinity. All these are very old. You see on the left column, which is a special university endowment, that's only about 40, 60, something like that, because it is going back to the Tudor period. The rest, 1500, which made this life livable at least, was college enrollment. And this is a whole other story, exactly how private colleges essentially took over this medieval institution and became a kind of a bastion of religious orthodoxy, at least in England. So this is, that's what I was after. That's why I was kind of trying to look at this figure. This is from 1870 Royal Commission, the Parliamentary Commission, to investigate. Finally, it took them 40 years to break down and to actually force the Oxford and Cambridge to come forward with their finances. Right. So
They
this
never
is-
get it done here at the University of Chicago.
This was a 19th century heroic effort to try to dismantle colleges, private foundations that are colleges, which all had all the wealth, and try to convert those universities into a national institution, like Berlin. And they haven't quite succeeded at that. No.
You make reference in this presentation to the rise of philology in the 19th
Yes.
century, and it's kind of the important role that plays in the story. And part of that, it seems to me, is the encounter with Indian languages and the sort of discovery of Aryanism. And I wondered if you could sort of comment on how that affects this.
Sure. That discovery, of course, did not happen until the very late 18th century. Although, I think one could argue, and I think one should be careful, that it wasn't just all William Jones, and there were earlier figures that are. But the consequence of all this did not really come to the fore until people like Schlegel essentially made basically India the home of all of the Aryans, as it were, right? And eventually it becomes a kind of idea of a Caucasus being the kind of originating point, so that instead of the Schlegel's idea was that everything and absolutely everything came from India, right? That is his famous saying in one of his letters, which was, by the way, very troubling to many Europeans, right? Even the Germans, the Hegel and Goethe in particular did not like the idea that Europe originated in the country that produced so many gods with too many hands and too many heads and kind of that kind of a prolixity disturbed them. So they settled on Caucasus. And that somehow there was some that went south and east, and then some went north and west. That's why it's still called Caucasian. Right? This was a sort of a coupling of the emerging racial theories together with this so-called discovery of the Indo-European language group, otherwise known as Aryan group.
And they used to call the languages of the Caucasus, most of which are not related to each other.
Absolutely,
Oh,
that's the thing, right? Georgian itself is neither one of those, none of the above categories. But the important thing was that it really separated the world of the Semitic world, which is really essentially the North Africa to the Levant and to Mesopotamia, right? And separating that strand from the Europe. And that's where I think it's really the real effort to appropriate Greece into the European past really comes very, very important, right? And again, I show, sorry that I should have a better way of getting back to this, but one of the things that I show is, of course, the Alexander the Great, right? Because he's supposed to be, so many things are riding on his horseback, as it were, because he's supposed to be the carrier of this pan-Hellenism, from which Christianity became supposedly possible, right? But actually look at his pedigree, right? The king of Macedonia, but also Pharaoh of Egypt, and king of Persia, and king of Asia. Right? And this is what the Alexander Empire really looked like, and in the world historical sense. Does this look like Europe? I show that, in fact, the Hellenic world looked way, way to the east. Right? So, in a way, I think it was a real conceptual feat to appropriate this entirely to Europe, right? Which is to completely ignore who else. And in fact, who predominantly were the heir to the world. And of course, medieval historians from early 20th century knew this all along, because origin of universities in Europe really is because of the sudden kind of increased in contact with the Arabic-speaking Islamic world. And they were the ones, of course, through the translation movements based on in Baghdad, preserved all this Greek philosophy and science, right, in the 10th century, 11th century, and so on. So this whole the Islamic mediation seems to be completely suppressed, right, in thinking about Europe and Greek, Europe as heir to Greece, right? So that's what I would say. In other words, Sanskrit discovery had all these things writing on it. I mean, the Greek was Greco-Roman, so somewhat inconvenient that India had to come into this whole thing, and yet that was what I think it made that calculation, the reconfiguration of the imaginary possible.
Just on the point of the suppression of the Islamic influence, I remember reading a wonderful, in some way, wonderful article by a Spanish scholar. I think he was in exile in Argentina, called Claudio Sanchez Albornoz. That's an interesting hyphenated name. Second part of which is clearly an Arabic name. He wrote a book about cities of Spain or Iberia in the medieval period. And he talks about the development of these cities, and he makes a statement somewhere. He says, Spanish culture owes nothing to Oriental influences.
Mm.
800 years of Muslim occupation had no impact whatsoever.
Yeah. No, in fact, I kind of, without really spelling out, I emphasize the Nuremberg Chronicles, because that's a year after not only the Columbus voyage, but also Alhambra decree, right? So from that period, it's the Spanish expulsion of the Jews. That year, really, it's critical. I think that's a significant year. At least it's continued.
We can break for coffee for a while.
Yeah.
Sure.
Sorry. So there was a very interesting point that I kind of, from your presentation, about whether Islam belongs to the east or to the west. And I was thinking about my own personal experiences. When you take an ancient civilization course in any typical high school, you focus a lot on the west. And then there's always like an eastern part. You never, well, at least for me, I never really focused on the Middle East. And I was wondering, and then there's also the fact that when Europe kind of redefines its identity, it tries to claim its Greek past, but also try to connect and disconnect itself at the same time from its Semitic roots in terms of Christianity. So try to claim its Greek identity, Christian identity. So I guess where does that leave the Middle East and Islam? I just want to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah. I think in the 19th century, the argument becomes very strong that in fact Islam, even though it came after Christianity, it's not an offshoot or the deviation from Christianity, but actually it is from the earlier deviation. It's a kind of a, belated alchemicism, and that it developed out of Judaism. That claim was very strong, and then they seem to really kind of justify that in part in terms of geography. Obviously, it started in the the East, and that has nothing to do with European Christendom, and at least the western part of it, and so on and so forth. So I think that there's an interesting and I think ultimately a bit troubling trend now, and I teach in couplet as well. Now they're trying to expand and they talk about world literature, right? And they start with what? You guessed it, Gilgamesh, right? It's in a way trying to appropriate, and also I guess it's at the same time kind of gloss over that whole troublesome past of this East and West construction, right? Which is completely racialized. And you can't avoid it. You look at anything in the 19th century, it's staring at you, right? There's no way of avoiding it. And so I think there are lots of different ways of trying to somehow mediate it, right? And I'm not really necessarily saying that that's a bad thing. I mean, I think it's not a bad thing for people to learn about Mesopotamia, right? But it should be a whole lot more than just simply kind of extending it, as it were. Just simply kind of doing the land grab once again, as it were. Yeah. So, thank you for that.
Is there a question in the back?
From Aquinas, or thought developing out of Aquinas, viewed theology as the master science. And I wonder, in your study of philology, how much this study of religion becomes a reversal of that, in the sense that, to take up the theme of secularism, that there is a study of religion from the point of view of positivist science, that is not taking a religion as true, but religion as the culture of a civilization that has a social function, or in various ways. Is this like, as Weber would put it, like a desacralization of thought?
Well, actually not on the straight line. In fact, the history of the university was such that, after, say, 16th, 17th century, for the most part, the university as an institution declined. And in fact, by the end of the 18th century, towards the end of that was an institution pretty much everybody wanted to get rid of. That this was no future. So read Adam Smith, read Gibbon, read pretty much everybody who had any kind of experience in the 18th century. They're thinking this is like a medieval sort of invented, which was, of course, the only real remaining curriculum was a smattering of Greek and Latin and theology. Right? So if you look at that early modern period, the university itself was not at all had kind of the prominence that it came to have starting again in the 19th century. It's only after that. So I think theology faculty, to the extent that it was associated with the university curriculum or university faculty, it was not at all respected. And so that's all the more, by the way, the role of Schleiermacher as the first dean of the newly established University of Berlin was enormously important, because he's the one who, forget about philology, but the theology itself has to be a Wissenschaft. And he called it that, right? So he would call that there are three branches of theology, and nothing, this is not going to look anything like the medieval theology in a way. It is historical theology, which of course included all the philological science, philosophical theology, which is probably closest to the kind of learning of the classical theology, and practical theology. In other words, for those of you who really are going to be a clergy, yeah, we teach that too. But the important thing is philosophical one and historical one. And so in Germany, at least, theology was transformed. And I think a great deal of credit would go to the University of Berlin. Wilhelm von Humboldt was the first Minister of Education equivalent. and to Sharma Hall. So I think he's justly famous for it. So in a sense, that medieval theology didn't really survive, I think, as at least in the form of university education. Now, survival through particular religious order, for example, that I know much, much less about. So I can't really sort of say, I mean, I don't mean to say that there was no other place in which the study of Thomas or other medieval theology was important. I mean, obviously it must have been, but it wasn't the university.
Take a coffee break for half an hour. I think it's rather lovely that we have a conference on secularism and the citizen that ends with Alexander the Great.
We thank you for listening to or viewing our podcast. For more information and for other podcasts, please see our website, divinity.uchicago.edu/podcasts. Copyright, the University of Chicago Divinity School.